Good morning, everyone. My name is Wendy Wayne, and I serve as the chair of the ABA Commission on Immigration. In my day job, I direct the Immigration Impact Unit at the Massachusetts Public Defender's Office. I am very happy to welcome you to our program today, and I'm honored to be here with three extraordinary individuals to discuss rebuilding America's immigration system and the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. Each of our distinguished speakers comes from a different place and perspective within the immigration debate. Unfortunately, Esther Olivaria, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council, is not able to join us today, and she sends her regrets. However, we are incredibly fortunate to have with us today the Honorable Sylvia Garcia, who represents the 29th District of Texas. Congresswoman Garcia is joining us today from Texas. We want you to know that our hearts go out to you and to all Texans this week as you have been dealing with unimaginable consequences from the freezing temperatures. We truly hope that things improve quickly. Congresswoman Garcia is a native of Palito Blanco, a South Texas farming community. She was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in November 2018, becoming the first Latina ever to represent Texas's 29th congressional district. She serves on the House Judiciary and the House Financial Services Committees. Congresswoman Garcia has dedicated her life to her community and to public service. We also welcome Marilena Incapi, who is Executive Director of the National Immigration Law Center, a major organization dedicated to defending and advancing the rights of low-income immigrants in the U.S., and of the NILC Immigrant Justice Fund. Under her leadership, NILC and the IJF strategically combine litigation, policy, communications, narrative change, and movement building to effect transformational change. As an immigrant from Colombia, Marilena brings her lived experience and bilingual, bicultural perspective to her work. She is a nationally respected leader, a legal and political strategist in the immigrant justice movement, and a leading voice in the national conversation on immigration. And finally, we welcome Mary Giovanoli, who serves as a member of the ABA Commission on Immigration and works as Senior Counsel for Legal Strategy with Kids in Need of Defense, or KIND. At KIND, Mary works on a range of program priorities, sharing her deep expertise in asylum and refugee law and migration policy. She's the immediate prior executive director of the Refugee Council USA and previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Immigration Policy at the US Department of Homeland Security in the Biden administration. I encourage you all to read the full biographies of each of our speakers at the program website, as they are all deeply impressive leaders and experts in immigration law and policy. After the speakers give opening remarks, we're going to turn to a more interactive discussion of the challenges and opportunities that we face at this moment in trying to develop a fairer, more welcoming, and more just immigration system. We will be taking some questions from audience members at the end of the program. However, please make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A section of the platform, not the chat function. So, barely a month into the Biden Harris administration, there have been a dizzying array of executive actions, legislative proposals, and policy changes involving immigration, many of which are directed at reversing the draconian policies of the Trump administration. Others are aimed at forging a new, more positive path toward increasing immigration, promoting naturalization, and creating a more welcoming nation. Members of Congress have already introduced significant legislation, and advocacy groups, immigrant communities, and human rights organizations are all mobilizing to press for reform. The ABA Commission on Immigration has contributed its own voice to this discussion with the publication of a document called Achieving America's Promise, ABA Recommendations to Advance Justice, Fairness, and Efficiency, which provides analysis and recommendations for improving 5 aspects of the immigration system: a fair and balanced judicial process, access to counsel, detention reform, a return to a genuine humanitarian protection system, and ensuring that unaccompanied children are treated with the fairness and sensitivity that their unique vulnerabilities require. I encourage you to read our report, which is available on the Commission's website. This is an exciting and hopeful moment, but it's also a moment taking place within the context of a devastating pandemic, economic hardship, extremist threats to democracy, hyperpartisanship, and an increasing and long overdue awareness that systemic racism remains a significant and enduring stain on American values and American institutions. How will we thread the needle, and how should we understand the significance of immigration reform in this particular moment? For her perspective, I would like to turn first to Congresswoman Garcia. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you for your thoughts, and thanks to everyone for their thoughts and prayers. Texas is going through a major crisis right now, and I'm pleased to report that even though it's day 3 of no shower for me, I do have heating, but I still don't have water. And now that is the biggest thing facing us today is even though for us in the Houston area, many of us now have power. I was able to get back in my house yesterday. We don't have water, and it's not just water for drinking, it's water for cooking, water for bathing, and water for flushing that toilet. So it has been a challenge, and that's a challenge that I've been working on feverishly the last 2 days. And then next to that, our biggest challenge is food. People run out of food. They lost all their food in their freezer or refrigerator. The trucks have not been able to come in because of the icy conditions on the roads. So grocery stores have very empty shelves if they're open, because they too had no power, and they too lost a lot of their foods that were refrigerated or frozen, as a lot of our nonprofits and food banks. So we're having to this morning start from almost scratch one. I spent time with the United Way, with people from the Red Cross, the food bank. I'm doing an event there tomorrow at the food bank with volunteers. My friend from New York, Ocasio-Cortez, will be down here, Representative Cortez, to put focus on it. We've been doing some fundraising for him. So we're doing all of the above, but I did not want to miss this meeting because this is an issue that's been really important to me, to my family, to my district, and should in it for the state of Texas and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I've been working on immigration reform now since I was first in office. And as those of you who know my history, I've been in local government, county government, state government, and now in federal government. And it seems like we'll never get there quite to the finish line. And I'm sure that that is the first question everybody has in their mind. How will this Biden bill, how will this comprehensive immigration reform bill really get through the hurdles that we need to be able to get it on President Biden's desk for signing? And frankly, I have the question too. And we're working very hard through the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, through the Democratic Caucus. I know Speaker Pelosi met with the caucus yesterday about what we're going to need to do to make sure to get it done. Number one, we're going to keep working on it, and I'm sure it'll get out of the House. Our challenges will frankly be in the Senate, when we've got even some Democrats who have problems with part of some of our bill. We know we've got to really work on it. I know there's some people who would like to piecemeal it and pull the dreamers out, pull the farm workers out. I was surprised that even the farm workers are calling me that they want to sit down and talk because they want their own standalone bill. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and I agree, and I'm fully part of their endorsement process. We want a comprehensive bill that focuses on keeping families together. Because what happens if you start piecemealing and the focus is just on the dreamers and kids, then it's just on workers, and everybody forgets about the whole purpose of keeping families together, of making sure that in many of our communities, it's not just the mama and papa and the two kids, it's also the grandmother and the uncle that came to visit and stay. So it's about keeping families together. It's about making sure that there's a path there for citizenship for everyone, including TPS, DED, dreamers, farm workers, for everyone. And of course, there's different time periods for each one. And I don't want to get into a lot of the details because I know Maria Elena is here, and that she was one of our witnesses in our subcommittee on immigration recently. So I know she's going to probably talk about some of that. So how we're going to do it is just work really hard and try to make sure that we get everybody on board, and keep working as hard as we can, and to make sure that we stay focused. We don't want a repeat of, of what was it, 10 years ago, where we all had high hopes and then it just kind of tapered off. We don't want that again. So I know the speaker yesterday said she was open to the piecemeal approach. We're not quite there yet as a caucus, but of course, politics is the art of compromise. And if it takes something like that to get it done, I guess we'll look at it. The other thing that everybody keeps asking me is what happens to detention reform? Because, you said the ABA memo talks about 5 things, because, we also at the Congressional Hispanic Caucus want to make sure that the judges for immigration cases are independent. And we also want to make sure that there's real detention reform right after this, because while we can look at who comes in and who doesn't, and make sure everybody's protected, we treat them with dignity and respect. We don't do that if we catch them crossing the border without authorization. One thing that I really like about the Biden efforts is to change the name everywhere from illegal alien to something more humane. And I know that even in the subcommittee on immigration, we recently changed all our roles and everything to reflect unauthorized immigrant or authorized immigrant. So it's important. Those things are about humanizing the folks involved. And detention reform is very necessary because we've seen the abuses in our detention centers. We've seen the abuses even in some of the children's detention centers and homes around the state. And we certainly saw the horrific case in Georgia with the unwanted, unnecessary surgeries being performed on women. And that's the only thing that would add, Wendy, to some of your ABA picture. Don't forget what's going on with abuses against women in particular, about who we are in some of those abuses. I know I had a bill that I'll be filing again on making sure that there's no restraints on women, especially that are going through their after pregnancy issues, because they're using physical restraints on some of these women. So I think there's some things that we must do to clean up those detention centers. That's why we need real reform. So I'm looking forward to working with y'all. Mary, I don't know that you and I have worked in the past, but look forward to in the future. And Wendy, thank you again for putting this together. And everybody, if you want to help send prayers or send money to our Houston Food Bank, it will be inundated when they open their doors, I think today or tomorrow, to start helping people. So thank you all again for your support and your thoughts and prayers.
Congresswoman Garcia, thank you so much for those thoughtful comments. I understand that you're unable to stay for the entire program, but I was wondering if I could ask you a question or two before
Sure.
we have to leave. First of all, I greatly appreciate your comments about not doing this piecemeal, and how, I personally in my day job represent people who have been involved in the criminal justice system. And when it comes to doing piecemeal legislation or piecemeal advocacy efforts, there's been for years such a dichotomy of sort of deserving and non-deserving immigrants. And my clients, who are also family members and also longtime members of the community and may have old minor criminal convictions and may be legal or maybe not, are often the ones who are sort of the first to be sacrificed when it comes to immigration reform. So I really appreciate your comments about holding it all together and trying to do real reform this time. And also the sort of lack of anything that we've heard so far about detention, which I think we may talk about a little bit later with Mary and Marilena. But I did want to ask you, you have supported so many issues ensuring the rights of immigrants, such as preventing the shackling of pregnant women in detention, as you just talked about, barring ICE from enforcement actions near polling places,
Yes.
preventing the eviction of mixed status families from federal housing. These concrete problems really point to much greater systemic discrimination. And the question for you is, how do we reform DHS agencies to create a fairer and more balanced enforcement system? And is that possible under the current DHS framework?
Well, I think first of all, the president naming of Secretary Mayorkas is a huge step, because I think he is committed to taking a full review of DHS and making any internal restructuring and reforms within the agency. I mean, he is committed to do that. He's already said so. And it's my understanding from friends that have talked with him directly. I have not, that he is committed to, if he has to, just sort of, it's one of the largest agencies and it's so many different pieces. I think he's going to be willing to give up a piece if he has to. And I think that's very refreshing, because usually anyone who comes into a position, again, I've been in government a long time. It's all about the size of your budget and how many employees you have, so that you've got your biggest, fiefdom. But if he looks at it in terms of, objective, goals, and what's needed to accomplish the reforms that are needed with the immigration system, with the detention system, and then with all the other pieces that he's got under his wings, I think it's going to be easier. And secondly, I think that Congress has to, just like we keep oversight over any agency under any president, we tried real hard under the previous president, and he fought us all the time on any reform or any oversight. I mean, you all know he refused and ordered people to refuse appearing before us, or refuse subpoenas. So I think that we're not going to face that with this administration. But just because he's from our party and our friend doesn't mean we're not going to keep a watchful eye. I mean, we have to do that, and we will. I'm particularly concerned about what will happen in those detention centers. I favor just getting rid of all the privatized detention centers. And I also favor making sure that we make them as humane as possible. I have visited so many. I think the best run ones are usually the faith-based ones. They always come, and the one I've always, almost was delighted in visiting was a sort of a halfway house set up setting in San Antonio, and I did that when I was head of the Senate Hispanic Congressional, not Congressional Caucus, but Senate Hispanic Caucus. And there's a lot that you can do that we're not doing in alternatives to detention, and alternatives to keep the families together. That I know that we can get it done under this administration and this secretary. It will not be overnight. People need to remember, Joe has only been there a month. Please lower the notch a little bit on the criticism and the pressure. He just got started. But look at what he's already done. He's rescinded the zero tolerance policy. He's rescinded the separation of families policy. He's changing the name of illegal alien. He's 100-day moratorium. He's got Daca is back in place. He put the task force on separation of families. I mean, you said that, Wendy, a litany of executive orders. So those are all super, super good signs. And the biggest thing is, you know, we've got a person with a heart at the White House. It's no longer the inhumane, cruel policies that of the past. So I think we all need to just kind of keep focused, keep working together, be patient, and just keep our eye on the ball.
I have one more question for you if you have time.
Okay.
So my question is sort of a general, obvious one, but in this hyper-partisan environment in Congress, what is it going to take to build bipartisan support for immigration reform? And will Congress consider trying to get some of this through reconciliation, or you know, and at what point is that strategy, if it is a strategy, going to come into play?
Well, I must admit, no one's mentioned doing this to reconciliation. I think we're all focused on just trying to keep the bill all together, and trying to convince individual members of Congress as to why it's good for their district, in making sure that all our ally groups work with people in those members' districts to convince those members that it's something they have to do for the it's either for the kids, for the economy, and it's for families. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to take the time to really explain to some members how it truly impacts them. Like for Texas, if we don't have a good relationship with Mexico, particularly because we border it, then there's so much that impacts our entire economy. And that's why business supports immigration reform. That's why when it came to fighting some of the anti-immigrant laws in Texas when I was a state senator, I mean, it was because business lied with us. You know, they no longer just see us as workers. I must admit, some do, but many of them know that it's bigger than that. It's about the interdependency of both sides of the border, in trade, in business, in educational skill levels. I mean, it's everything. So I think that's what we need to do with every member of Congress. We're going to have to take the time to do it. So this bill may not move as fast as some of us want, but it's because we're going to have to really work it before we can get there. But again, we just have to be patient, and we've got to keep the eye on the ball and just keep working it hard. We can get it done.
I'm glad to hear your optimism, and I'm
a social worker at heart. You know, that was my first degree was in social work, and I just had a meeting with United Way about some of the problems we have in terms of taking care of people. And I told him, I said, look, my first degree is in social work, and I think I've been a social worker ever since. But no, we've got to be optimistic, and we've got to put trust in the change that's coming from the White House. I know that for Joe, it's more than just a policy thing. It really is a faith-based policy issue with him. I mean, I saw and read what he said to the Jesuits group right after the campaign, and he said, "I am committed." And you don't sit in front of a group of Jesuits and say you're committed and not keep your word, because that would be a hell of a lot of Hail Marys that he's going to have to say if he doesn't keep his word.
Congresswoman Garcia, thank you so much for joining us today. We again send our thoughts and prayers to all of you in Texas. We hope things improve there soon. We really appreciate your joining us today and sharing your perspective. And we will all be working as hard as we can to provide the support to get this legislation through Congress. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, and God bless. So
I would now like to ask Mary Giovanoli for her perspective, if you would, Mary.
Sorry about that. I had muted myself. Well, it's awfully hard to follow the wonderful Congresswoman Garcia. I could listen to her all day, and I'm just so grateful for her support for the country and the tremendous perspective she brings. My job on this panel is a little bit different. And so I am heartened to hear, I think, as we know, that we have a president who values the role of immigrants and immigration in America. And both the president and vice president have repeatedly pledged their support for immigration reform. But what does that mean as a practical matter, and what can be done in the short term and what requires long-term commitment and vision? I think you got a sense of that already from the Congresswoman remarks. But my role today is really to sketch out the framework of the policy that's been laid out thus far in the Biden-Harris administration, juxtapose that against the critique offered by the ABA of necessary reforms, and point a bit to where the challenges will be. To do this, however, I need to take you on a barnstorming tour of the Biden-Harris immigration framework. In the span of his first 14 days in office, President Biden issued 10 executive orders, memos, and proclamations designed to reverse or mitigate the worst of the Trump administration's actions on immigration. Additional memos addressing immigration enforcement, including declaring a deportation moratorium issued from DHS. Just yesterday, the United States Citizenship Act, the bill sent to Congress by the Biden-Harris administration, was introduced with Congresswoman Garcia as an original co-sponsor. And today, the process of officially unwinding the Remain in Mexico program begins with the first of thousands who will register in order to enter the United States to pursue their asylum cases. After 4 exhausting years of blistering attacks on refugees and immigrants, you couldn't blame folks for being a trifle giddy when President Biden chose to use some of his day one capital on immigration. With a few strokes of the pen, the president repealed the Muslim and African travel ban, ended construction of the border wall, restored deferred action for childhood arrivals, announced new limited enforcement priorities, and restored deferred enforced departure for Liberians. He rescinded President Trump's immigration orders left and right, and then released his framework for a comprehensive reform package, all before whatever virtual events he may have attended that night to celebrate the inauguration. Shortly thereafter, more executive actions announced sweeping plans to change migration patterns in Central America, to rebuild the asylum system, to restore legal immigration, to revive and renew the refugee resettlement program, and to protect the rights of LGBTQI refugees and asylum seekers. The president also established task forces on integration, naturalization, and for family reunification to try to address the cruelties of the family separation policy of the Trump administration. So those are the highlights, end of the tour. But how do we make sense of it all? And what does it mean for those who are eager to regularize their status and others who seek protection and safety? I think that if you take a longer look at these various actions, try to step back from them a little bit, they group into 3 categories. The first is administrative actions that are solely within the control of the executive branch. The second is reforms that can be made under existing laws, particularly if those laws can be read more generously, funds can be reprogrammed, or there's a broad area of policy discretion. And the third are reforms that require actual changes to the law, new appropriations, or other buy-in from stakeholders that simply can't be done alone. So for instance, rescinding the executive order banning travelers from predominantly Muslim or African countries falls under the first category, as does restoring Daca. In the first instance, the president has the authority to limit categories of travelers when they're deemed by him or her to be a threat to national security. Unfortunately, as we learned, that authority can be abused. And the Supreme Court ultimately gave the president wide latitude in exercising that authority, no matter how immoral or how hurtful. By rescinding Trump's executive order on day one, Biden not only reversed an unpopular and discriminatory order, but he also signaled that he understood how much damage could be done, how much power the president wields, and how important it is to take his new authority seriously. The revival of Daca reveals a different aspect of that issue of authority. In this case, the Supreme Court had actually affirmed the executive branch's authority to widely exercise prosecutorial discretion. Here, where using presidential authority would help rather than harm people, the president eagerly wielded the pen. So I think the first clear lesson is that the Biden administration will lean into exercises of authority where it can help people. There are other examples, including increasing refugee admissions from 15,000 to roughly 62,000 for the fiscal year, that demonstrate a more generous spirit. Many other initiatives included in this first suite of orders, however, fall more into a middle ground where the task can't be summarized in a few paragraphs or a policy reversed by the president saying, so be it. Instead, many of the orders issued to the executive branch require studies and reports, and although on a fairly short timeline, they're aimed at trying to bring broader internal change. For instance, the executive order requiring review of all enforcement priorities is itself very short. It opens with a policy statement. It says, the task of enforcing the immigration laws is complex and requires setting priorities to best serve the national interest. The policy of my administration is to protect national and border security, address the humanitarian challenges at the southern border, and ensure public health and safety. We must also adhere to due process of laws as we safeguard the dignity and well-being of all families and communities. My administration will reset the policies and practices for enforcing civil immigration laws to align enforcement with these values and priorities. In the next paragraph, it revokes one of President Trump's earliest executive orders, which put into place a framework for extremely punitive deportation-driven enforcement. As a part of the revocation, agencies are then directed to review and revise the policies that have been issued during the Trump era, and then bring them in line with the president's stated policy. That's it. That's the executive order. The acting secretary of DHS immediately issued an implementation memo setting interim enforcement priorities that focus primarily on removing persons who are threats to national security and public safety, as well as new border crossers. This memo also included a 100-day deportation moratorium and orders to review cases for their fit within those new priorities. Unfortunately, a politically motivated lawsuit brought by the state of Texas has led to an injunction against the moratorium. Nonetheless, internal guidance issued from ICE yesterday reaffirmed the importance of individual review and assessment of priorities. And I'm sure we'll talk about that guidance more as we move into the question and answer section. But a complete set of revised guidance from the desk of Secretary Mayorkas is also promised within the next few months. This sequencing is important. The president sets policy, gives enough guidance to send the agencies in the right direction, and then entrusts the bulk of the work to the agencies themselves. The success of this strategy depends on a host of things, including the level of cooperation between the White House and DHS, as well as the clarity of the policy and how it's expressed from top to bottom within an organization. And frankly, this has always been one of the greatest weaknesses of US immigration policy, a significant disconnect and sometimes a disregard for the policies issued at the top of the chain. We're already seeing this, particularly in continued deportations of Haitians and Africans who may have been unfairly evaluated for removal. There are reports on the ground that suggest that interventions from advocates have helped to stop some of these removals, but the deportation machine is huge and often moves without regard to the plight of individuals. It's important to remember, I think, that it took the Obama administration 6 years to significantly reduce the arc of deportations, requiring progressively more intervention from the White House. Many of the people implementing the new policies are veterans of the Obama years. And I think you can see in the much more detailed orders coming out of DHS and ICE, the greater coordination, the willingness to engage with the public, that there is a concerted attempt to try to provide clear and consistent messages. But it won't be easy. And it's going to take advocacy and communication and significant public engagement and pressure for DHS to realize the potential envisioned by the president. There's also a significant difference that we have to bear in mind between the implementation of domestic immigration policies and those that turn on international cooperation and diplomacy. The executive order calling for a deep financial commitment to address root causes of migration from Central America to help to improve and increase capacity for protection in countries on the route to the US and to improve the US asylum system takes the boldest strokes where the driving factor is foreign policy. As the order moves into domestic asylum policy, it necessarily becomes more constrained, directing reviews and recommendations for new regulations and other policies that will undo the asylum mess created by the Trump administration, but that left behind a legacy of horrible regulations and litigation and other things that are going to have to be sorted out by the Biden administration, things that will unfortunately take time. There's an inherent recognition, I think, that the president has a freer hand in certain things, particularly, for instance, in dealing with refugee matters, as evidenced by the highly detailed executive order designed to completely reform the refugee resettlement system. It goes into extreme detail about various types of security checks and interagency working groups that reflects the fact that the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is an interagency creature, driven as much by the National Security Council and the Department of State as it is by DHS, and that keeping it running requires significant White House oversight. Finally, there's the third category, legislation. The Us Citizenship Act, which one can read as the administration's vision for a complete reformation of the immigration laws, is an important marker of the long-term values that the Biden administration wants to carry into the immigration debate. At its core is a recognition that longtime members of our communities, regardless of their immigration status, make significant contributions. It creates a series of mechanisms to ensure that people who've lived in this country for years without status have a way to become lawful permanent residents and ultimately citizens. The bill tackles far more than legalization, however. Some of it's symbolic, but very important, such as the elimination of the word alien in favor of non-citizen throughout the Immigration and Nationality Act, a step that's long overdue. And I might point out that even in the memo released yesterday by ICE, the word non-citizen is used rather than alien. So the Biden administration clearly has already adopted that change in language that emphasizes the humanity of people rather than their differences. Some of the changes or proposals in the bill are pragmatic, such as increases in visa numbers that better reflect the demand for both employment and family immigration to the US and address the outstanding backlogs that keep families separated, that keep businesses from growing, that keep the country from really realizing the full value of immigration. And some of it's just plain inspired, such as the creation of broad waiver authority in removal and benefits cases that would allow adjudicators to exercise judgment and to give each person his or her due. In addition, the bill would do things like provide appointed counsel to children and other vulnerable immigrants in court. It would recognize the depth of the refugee crisis in Central America by setting up a Western refugee resettlement process. It would recognize that issues like protection from wage theft and occupational safety are rights for all workers, not just those who have immigration status. And it would address many, many other issues that are about the integration and the welcoming nature of America, creating a space for those things to take place. If this bill were to pass intact, it would provide an enormous boost to our economy, enhance stability of our communities, and create the space for rejoicing in our diversity and heritage in a way that could heal much of what ails us today. If, and it's a big if, as Congresswoman Garcia has already suggested. I'm going to defer to Marilena to discuss the challenges and opportunities the advocacy movement faces in both moving this legislation forward and ensuring accountability from the Biden administration. The Biden actions thus far set out both a policy goal and a policy challenge, though. Communities need to use the vision and commitment expressed in these policies to constantly hold the administration to its own commitments. We have the opportunity, however, to do this in a less adversarial way than with the past administration, one in which we can finally engage in dialogue and public engagement, and have a belief that our concerns will be heard and use that engagement to press for more reforms. It's important to note that the ABA is playing a vibrant role in this engagement in championing immigration reform. The Commission on Immigration's latest report that Wendy referred to, Achieving America's Immigration Promise, sets out that recommendations for reform in the 5 key areas Wendy addressed. And it's a call for a just and fair immigration system that every lawyer and person who cares about the rule of law can take pride in. In fact, the ABA goes further than the US Citizenship Act in calling for the creation of an Article 1 immigration court, joining with many other bar associations in the conclusion that the consequences of immigration removal have become too grave to leave it to an administrative court system that's far too subject to political pressure. It also details common sense reforms of the detention system, including the value of embracing a much more limited form of civil detention that recognizes that immigrants are not criminals. The report further details the ABA's commitment to common sense adjudications, the protection of vulnerable asylum seekers, and the particular duty of care we owe to the children who find their way into our system alone and without support. I urge you to read the report and to engage with Commission members during this important and exciting time. And I'll turn it back to you, Wendy.
Thank you, Mary. You've given us lots to talk about after we hear from our next speaker. I'd like to ask Mary Elena Incapié to please state your opening or give your opening remarks about the priorities that you see right now.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thanks to you and Meredith and everyone who helped to organize this event today. It's really great to share the virtual stage with Mary G and with Congresswoman Garcia as well. I first, want to start by saying I was so happy to see the ABA Commission organizing this event at the start of the administration, and I was, as I was preparing, reminded of when I was on the commission under Karen Grosset's great leadership back in February of 2010. We issued a very similar and robust report that Arnold and Porter helped to organize, and many, many lawyers, including many of you on this conference today, helped to participate. And so much of that vision back in 2010 is still undone, right? It still needs to be addressed. And I'm very hopeful that we are at the beginning of a new era under the Biden and Harris administration for us to achieve as much of our vision as possible, or lay the foundation for that transformational change that's truly what's needed in our society. I'll start by saying that the last 4 years, I really, truly believe we are experiencing and have experienced collective trauma in this nation. Like, every one of us has experienced it in so many different ways. And for immigrant families, right, for our families, for our loved ones, it has felt nothing less than a war by the last administration. And I say it's a war, both a narrative and policy war. You all know, because many of you are practitioners and know what the impact has been on your clients, but the level of fear that people have been living with for the last 4 years, the deaths, the exiling of people who've been deported, the sheer emotional, psychological trauma, particularly on the children who've been ripped away from their families. What has been allowed over the last 4 years, we are going to be dealing with the healing from that trauma for decades to come still. And the level of reparations, frankly, that I believe is what's needed ultimately, since this was all done with taxpayer money. And so I'm hopeful that in this new era that we're beginning now, that was delivered, frankly, by the most historic, multiracial, multi-generational, multi-ethnic coalition that voted in record numbers, right? Despite a pandemic, despite voter suppression, the fact that so many people across political ideologies came out and elected President Biden, I believe, gives him the mandate to deliver on the promises. And among those promises, of course, are some of what we've already heard today from both Representative Garcia and Mary. So I'm going to focus first on 3 of the priorities that we at the National Immigration Law Center have had, and then second, really look at what I'm seeing as the path forward over the next 4 years, and then really excited to enter into more of a Q&A. And so, for the last 4 years at the National Immigration Law Center, we've had 3 major priorities. There have been so many attacks on immigrants, but we decided to focus on 3. First and foremost, it was to continue to support the leadership and courageous efforts by immigrant youth in our country. The Daca recipients that fought for and won the Daca policy, but also who were then impacted. And we had the great honor of representing courageous plaintiffs who we were able to sue within 3 hours of Trump announcing the termination of Daca. Because of their effort, our case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. We represent the plaintiffs in the Batalla case in the Second Circuit. We now represent 1.1 million class members who are either eligible for DACA as first-time applicants or are currently DACA recipients. I can't tell you how, one, transformative DACA has been for their individual life, but most importantly, what the election meant for them. The sigh of relief that our plaintiffs, text messages I immediately got, like, this is real. It feels like we are finally going to be able to stay here in our home country with our families. And their dreams that so many of them have been deferred, they have been so courageously fighting the Trump administration, and now see that there's a possibility for them and for their families to remain together in this country, which is their home country. And as Mary already noted, President Biden immediately on day one, that was one of the announcements made of preserving DACA. However, as many of you know, there is a case in Texas, in Judge Hanen's court, which we're expecting decisions at some point, and most likely will be a negative decision that would impact DACA. That was originally a lawsuit from Texas against the DAPA program, the Deferred Action for Parents of U.S. citizen and LPR children. But because of the continued legal limbo that immigrant youth are living with, the fact is we need a permanent solution by Congress. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Second, the other priority for us was the Muslim ban, Muslim and African bans. So we similarly had the great honor to file the first lawsuit under the Trump era on behalf of Mr. Darwish, who was an Iraqi refugee who had been detained at JFK. I'm sure all of you remember this because it was all over the news. And that was the case that prompted, was that detention of Mr. Darwish, and who was immediately separated from his family, his wife and children when they arrived at JFK, despite having gone across through all of the security vetting and having a visa approved in hand. He was flying to the United States when the Muslim ban was announced. It was that case that really, and that spurred the better angels that we have in the United States, that all over the country, volunteers, including so many law students and lawyers, went to volunteer at airports across the nation and across the globe, frankly, because of the impact. And, we were able to file that lawsuit. I remember being up 24 hours on Friday, starting around 5 p.m. Friday evening, to filing on Saturday morning through e-file. And our former litigation director, Karen Tumlin, filed that. We were partnering with both the Yale Law School Clinic, the incredible law students there, and the ACLU. And we got a victory that weekend. And it was the first victory against the Trump administration. But the fact is that we then had to sue over the Muslim ban as a whole. And as Mary G has already talked about the litigation history on that, for us at the National Immigration Law Center, we knew that the litigation by itself was not enough. We knew that understanding that both the termination of DACA and particularly the Muslim and then followed by the African bans was a result of immigrants not have enough political power. Second, the narrative, particularly around Islamophobia and the attacks that the previous administration was making on Muslims, that all of that is what made possible that the Muslim ban could actually even become law, and that the Supreme Court would give its imprimatur. And so we launched a campaign with our Muslim and Arab and South Asian community members so that they can help lead and build a capacity in the communities to really address at the root of what is that Islamophobia? How do we change the narrative, and how do we ensure that our Muslim brothers and sisters are also seen as humans and as essential as the rest of the immigrant communities, and to really counter the national security framework that is so undergirding our immigration system, especially since 9/11. And then finally, and again, the President Biden announced on day one the rescinding of the Muslim and African bans. However, it's not enough to simply undo those. Like, we now have to deal with how do we reunite families? How do we ensure that the people that were denied entry into the United States now have a streamlined process to be able to apply to come and be reunited with family members or attend university or employment, which were many of the other areas impacted. And then finally, the other third priority has been the public charge rule. For us at the National Immigration Law Center, because our mission is specifically focused on low-income immigrants, we knew from the first day that the public charge rule was leaked that the impact was going to be detrimental. We had no idea that 4 years later we would be dealing with a pandemic. And it's exactly this moment of a pandemic that has shown us how interdependent we all are, how our collective health and well-being as a society requires all of us being healthy, that the public charge is that big barrier, that fear that people have, that chilling effect that people have, and the confusion that people have over what can they apply for. Can they access healthcare? Can they get tested for COVID or not? Should they apply for the vaccine? I mean, we are seeing right now the life-threatening impact that a rule like the public charge rule has had on immigrant communities across the nation, and then of course on all of our public health. And so, at a time when we are dealing, as you said, Wendy, with the pandemic, with an economic crisis and racial injustices and uprisings around those racial injustices, I believe that we need to see this moment as a moment to call for bold and transformative change, but one that centers immigrants in that broader agenda. That, we have been at this, right, for many of us on this conference for decades, seeking these changes that are not coming and haven't been coming due to a failed lack of leadership whether at the White House or in Congress. And this is the moment, like, we can no longer wait to deliver relief for our communities. And so I'll close here by saying that I'm very hopeful that the Biden-Harris administration has put forth a very bold vision that's laid out in the US Citizenship Act and in the commitment to undoing the harms of the Trump administration. But most importantly, that we're beginning the process of building a 21st century immigration system. We are in the third decade of this century, and we are still operating with an immigration system from the 1980s, and that is completely unacceptable. And the role of the ABA Commission is to really remind our nation that we are, and to take back this idea, this framing that we are a nation of laws, and that the current laws that we have are simply unjust and dysfunctional. And we must, as a nation, really work together to build a legal system that is just, that delivers due process and fairness to everyone in our country, regardless of where we were born, how much money we have, or the color of our skin. And so I'll close by saying that I'm really excited to partner with the ABA and the commission, but the ABA as a whole, because I do think that this has to be the issues that we are fighting for need to be embraced by the ABA as a whole and our legal profession as a whole. Similarly to the broader immigrant rights issues cannot be fought simply by the immigrant rights movement, right? Children's advocates, anti-poverty, the labor movement, racial justice, gender justice groups all need to embrace immigrants as part of our nation. Immigrants are essential to who we are as a nation, and we must all work together to bring about the transformational change that we envision at the National Immigration Law Center, and that I know all of you share as well. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. I agree, and many of us, I think, on the commission agree that the more perspectives and the more perspectives across our society that can come together for true reform, the better chance we have. The ABA is a large organization that represents legal interests across the spectrum, right? And I think that's an example of one organization that when we speak out about things like due process and access to counsel, it provides a different perspective and an important voice in the discussion about what is fair to provide to people who are trying to represent themselves in a system where there are lawyers and judges in the other parts of the system with no access, and they have no access to counsel. Anyway, and we may get back to that issue, but I want to start with a couple questions for both of you. So this is a question from a member of our audience. Back in 2013, there was a strong bipartisan effort to pass immigration reform legislation. What caused that effort to fail, and what lessons can we learn to inform our efforts today so that we can hopefully be more successful?
You want to start, Mary?
Sure. let's frame it up a little bit. 2013, it was the last chapter in, efforts that really started, I'd say around 1996 with the passage of the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. It's been a long time since I've said all those words out loud together, but which really created a very punitive model of immigration and really made it far more difficult for people to take advantage of opportunities that had existed in the system to get the discretion they needed to be able to regularize their status. And from there, the need to have a legalization component grew and grew and grew because we began to have more and more people who were here unlawfully with no safety valves, no way to get into the system. And at various points in time since then, we saw different bipartisan movements in the Senate or the House to make the push for immigration reform. And I think that in 2013, what we saw was a Senate that agreed to ultimately pass legislation, but it was passed at the cost of an extraordinarily high, debt to border communities, to militarizing the border, and to sort of buying into this mindset that you can't have immigration reform if you don't have draconian enforcement, frankly. And I think that from an outside perspective, it was at the Senate level something that people were willing to accept with the hope that it could be modified over the years. But of course, we had a House that was at that time not even willing to take it up, that was under Republican control. And so, you had the political divisions. You had, I think, the divisions that would have probably driven it apart ultimately within communities about the attitudes about enforcement in particular. But I also think in many ways, we still just hadn't gotten the message across that immigration reform is something that should matter to everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a first generation immigrant or your relatives came over on the Mayflower, or you were a person of color brought here as your family was brought here as an enslaved people hundreds of years ago. If we do immigration right, we improve America's economy, we improve our diversity and our ability to innovate and do so many wonderful things. If we do it wrong, it has a terrible impact on virtually every aspect of our social reform. And in some ways, I think, as Marielena pointed out, the pandemic has really helped to crystallize many of those issues. There's so much stuff we're fighting about that if we simply had an immigration system that works, would not be on the table and would make so many of our other social policies work better. So I think helping people to see the mindset that's necessary to really make immigration reform possible is a moment we just haven't fully had yet. I'd love to hear what you think, Marielena.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll pick up on one thing and then focus a little bit more about what it means for this time around, right? Because I think that's a lot of the questions that we're getting is like, why do we think this time around is any different, right? So I think the piece that I just wanted to emphasize that Mary said is, part of the strategy on immigration reform over the last 2 decades has been, frankly, Democrats starting at a place of conceding so much, right? Like going straight to the center as the starting negotiating point. And I don't know, I think every lawyer knows, like negotiations 101, you start with your vision for what you want, and then you negotiate as you get to the table. But instead, the approach has been, let's give Republicans as much as they want and hope that they come to the table. And that was a failed approach by the Obama administration, both on enforcement in terms of administrative generally, but also on the legislation. And there were lots of other politics within the Republican Party, particularly when Cantor lost, and then Boehner was like, absolutely not, this isn't happening. But for me, one of the big lessons from 2013, and particularly what has transpired in the country since 2013, especially over the last 4 years, is that it is no longer acceptable for us to allow this unbalanced negotiation to happen, right? I mean, if we take a pause and think about when the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11, so it was 2003 when it was formally created. Since 2003, we have spent $381 billion on interior and border enforcement. Almost every year, Congress appropriates more and more money. And what we haven't gotten in exchange for any of that is the other half of the bargain, the legalization. And so that's, I think, the big difference right now, that the Biden administration understands that old notion of we have to exchange citizenship for more detention and deportations and militarization is no longer the equation we're operating under, and cannot be. In fact, we have to be scaling back the way that the Department of Homeland Security has been operating. And so that's a starting point of where we are now. We're in a very different place. We're in a very different place even from 2016 and even 2019, when the House passed the Dream and Promise Act, for example, which would legalize immigrant youth as well as temporary protected status and DED holders. So I think, to me, the big difference, and it's unfortunate that Congresswoman Garcia is not on here, because I really differ with her on strategy when it comes to this, and this is part of the advocacy that we will need to do with both the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and other members of Congress, which is, look, absolutely, we should push for President Biden's blueprint. This is a blueprint for our nation. We believe that, for the most part, and I'll share one of the places that we don't agree on with the bill, that for the most part, this is a visionary document that should become law. It represents the values of the Biden-Harris administration and should become law. Guess what? We have a 50-50 split in the Senate. We have a narrower margin now in the House than we did even before the 2020 elections. And so it's actually we have to be politically realistic that it's unlikely that the Biden administration will be able to get an additional 10 Republicans. We should do the work. We should absolutely work to fight for getting those 10 Republicans. I believe that the immigration should be a bipartisan issue. We have had a history where and where there has been bipartisan support. And in fact, right now, since the Gallup poll started testing support for immigration and a pathway to citizenship and sentiments for immigrants since 1965, this is the highest support there has ever been for a pathway to citizenship across ideological and political ideology. And so I'm very hopeful that we can get it done, but the math makes it look really difficult. And I don't think that we should have an all or nothing approach and wait another 4 years or 8 years and be in the same place where we're looking at the ABA Commission's 2010 report and not having gotten that done, nor the 2021 report that you all now have issued. And so I think this is the year where we absolutely need to deliver relief for our communities. And if that means that we first provide a path to citizenship for immigrant youth and temporary protected status and DED families, and in addition to that, provide that for farm workers, I would add to that essential workers. I think the pandemic has created an opening where there is a recognition, and a growing recognition by the American public, that we are wholly dependent on immigrants in this country, and they are getting us through the pandemic. And so again, there's an opening, a political and a cultural opening, where if we do the work, we should be able to get legalization and a path to citizenship for essential workers. If we were to do just that, those 3 different bills, we're talking about 5-7 million people already, depending on the ultimate definition of essential workers. And that is huge. That allows them to eventually become citizens. It allows us to build more political power. It allows them to then petition for family members, and we continue building. I feel like in this moment where the last 4 years have been complete undermining of our democracy and a burning down almost of the infrastructure and system that we're operating in, we're in a rebuilding moment. And so each of these bills should be building blocks towards the ultimate home that we're trying to build for all of us to have the freedom to thrive in our country.
So that segues nicely to the next question that I wanted to ask, actually. But I do want to just mention that the 2010 report that you referenced, Marilena, we updated it in 2019 because much of what the ABA Commission on Immigration had recommended in 2010 had not yet been done, and there was more to add. So in addition to what we just issued for this new administration and for a new vision in 2021, we do have a 2019 updated report on reforming the immigration adjudication system, and that's also available on our website for people who are interested in reading that. And I would say it was both reports in 2010 and 2019 were done with the tremendous, invaluable help of many, many lawyers from Arnold and Porter, and we could not have done it without them. I do want to ask, Congresswoman Garcia did say, we haven't thought about budget reconciliation or as a way to get some of this through. I know that advocates have been starting to talk about it or are continuing to talk about it. And what you suggest raises a question of, is a strategy, at what point is a strategy to either get separate bills through, to get some of it passed through reconciliation, which only requires a majority as opposed to 60 votes, and how to do that without, again, pitting some priorities against other. And again, without saying these are who we've decided are deserving immigrants, but other immigrants who are, for example, detained. My perspective, many who may have been here lawfully for a very long time or without lawful status for a long time, but with significant roots in the community, who may have had some criminal justice contact that may very well have been a result of racial profiling or the war on drugs, or and how do we get through real change that is realistic to hope for without pitting some groups of immigrants against others or immigrants' priorities against others?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Wendy. I guess I'll say a couple of things and then turning it over to Mary. So first, like Congresswoman Garcia, I'm an optimist, right? I don't think any of us can do this work without being optimists, right? And so we as an organization, we're going to do everything to try to get those 10 Republicans. We're working very closely, for example, with the American Business Immigration Coalition, which has been doing a fabulous job partnering with us on getting COVID relief for mixed status families, immigrant taxpayers, for example, right? And so we are making progress on some bipartisan efforts. They're small and they're minor though, right? And so we want to be both optimistic and do the zealous advocacy that's required of us in this moment while being politically realistic and pragmatic. And so, yes, we believe that reconciliation is absolutely one of the strategies that needs to be considered. And we think that there's a parallel track. We both work to get the US Citizenship Act, which is, again, the president's bill, and at the same time, move certain pieces of legislation that will be building blocks. Look, everybody wants to win, right? And so if the president is able to sign into law an improved version of HR 6, the Dream and Promise Act, and that can be done before April 1st, because that was passed in 2019 by the House. That can be brought up for a vote, send that over to the Senate, get that probably can get bipartisan support, right? So let's put those community members on the track to citizenship. Same thing with farm workers. And then again, I think the essential workers is the one that most likely would need to have, and maybe not, right? Maybe we can get enough of the business community to recognize and Republicans to recognize the role of essential workers as well. But this is actually this is a political judgment that the White House ultimately is going to need to make, as well as Dem leadership on both the Senate and the House, because it's not only about immigration. Frankly, the president's entire progressive agenda will require Republican support as well. And I think he wants to provide a bipartisan approach. And I think he will try, but at some point, if he actually wants to win some of these policy changes, they will either have to address the filibuster or go the route of reconciliation and those bills that can be enacted with just that 50 vote threshold. So it's a larger political question for the Biden administration as a whole, and they're very cognizant of it. We're in very close conversations with the White House. And I do believe that they want to win. They want to provide relief for families. And then the last thing that I'll say, Wendy, on your point of the deserving, undeserving, it's absolutely critical for us at the National Immigration Law Center because we work at this intersection of race, class, and immigration status. You know, for us, we work on both the impact on the criminal legal system and the infirmities of that system, the injustices and structural challenges that people of color particularly have experienced, and poor people, right? And then on the other hand, the exclusion of immigrants from safety net programs and health. I mean, that is one of the places where the US Citizenship Act, for example, we are deeply disappointed that the Biden administration felt the need to exclude the people on a path to citizenship from access to healthcare in the middle of a pandemic, that even in this moment, they wouldn't have the wherewithal to understand why that is not good for us as a society. And so, yes, this notion of deserving, undeserving is something that we have to be very deliberate about and make sure that whatever progress we're making, we are not making that at the expense of others, but that the language that we use, and making sure that it's not just the narrative, but that the legislative language or policy language, if it's an executive order or departmental policy, actually helps expand. It's more expansive and inclusive rather than having this language that excludes people and that makes it more difficult for them to be able to be included down the path.
Mary?
Oh, I totally defer to Marilena's brilliant strategic mind in this discussion. The only thing I'll add is that I think that there are certain small moments or small provisions that say in the US Citizenship Act that signal a way forward in the short term at least. And so for instance, there is a provision that would provide very broad waiver authority so that in an individual case, one of the clients you described, Wendy, someone who had a criminal conviction that may on its face bar them from some type of benefit, that bar could be waived on an individual determination. I mean, if you think about it, most legalization programs are programs that say, collectively, we have so many people who are in a particular situation that doing case-by-case adjudications on the issue of whether or not they should get a benefit, it's just not practical. And so a legalization program is a stand-in for sort of an individualized assessment. And not that you don't have to have individualized assessments, but you don't have to ask the question of, does this group fit into a category? And so in the short term, I think that, you know, the US Citizenship Act and other provisions of law that people have put in or attempted to put in over the years that provide greater waivers, greater sort of discretion on the part of adjudicators and immigration judges, that give more discretion about when someone is deported, allowing them to come back into the country. There are ways, I think, even in, you know, sort of categorical fixes to provide some protection and some measure of hope for people who maybe aren't in that first category of people that get a benefit. So some of it is strategic thinking about what you put into a bill in addition to the primary piece. Some of it is, again, hopefully using the tools I think that the Biden administration has set out in the executive orders to act with greater thought and judgment about individual cases right now. Many of the clients you describe, even if they couldn't get full benefits right now, could still be, subject to deferred action or some kind of discretionary decision to stay their removal. There are still tools within the system that if we have, I think, a truly compassionate and thoughtful immigration system we can use. Those are short-term fixes. They aren't the fixes that we need to really make the system work, but we can cobble together some aid for some people if we're willing to take advantage of the tools that do exist.
Thank you. So there are some great questions in the Q&A, and I apologize to people who have posed those questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I would like to ask a couple. How will this bill address the growing immigration court backlog? Are they just planning to hire more? This is quoting from the question. Are they just planning to hire more judges, or are there more substantial measures that address the procedural failings and inefficiencies of immigration court? I do notice, speaking myself, that the Citizenship Act from yesterday offers bolstering immigration court resources to help the backlog, but does not address the failings of the system, which the ABA continues to strongly, which causes the ABA to continue to strongly advocate for an Article I immigration court. But does this bill provide sufficient suggestions to help, I guess is the question.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it's a start. Clearly, there's a need for more resources within the immigration courts, but you know, I do think that it has been a long and difficult discussion, even within, you know, the ABA, over what the appropriate way is to address immigration court issues and backlogs and things like that. And you know, creating a new Article I court is less about backlogs and more about creating a structure that we think is free from the political pressure that we've seen used over the years in the administrative court system. But I think you have to sort of look at the overall picture that the US Citizenship Act is proposing by moving many people out of the pathway of the deportation machine and into a legalization structure. You begin to reduce the number of people who are subject to immigration court. Many of them are probably in the backlog right now, or could be. By changing the way you tackle asylum cases and other sort of benefits related cases, you again sort of reduce the number of folks in immigration court. So I think there's a sense that you need to bolster what you've got to reduce backlogs, but ideally that wouldn't be the place that it ends. So, I mean, clearly, I think the ABA is encouraging more, but it's a good, it's at least a start towards trying to balance things out.
Yeah, I'll just briefly. So I agree that this is a start. I don't think the Citizenship Act does enough, right? There's a lot that needs to be done. Frankly, my hope is that a lot of that will be able to be done, or that there's a lot of the changes that are necessary that can be done administratively through the Department of Justice changes that they propose. And I think what we saw with the Department of Homeland Security is clearly that was a priority, getting Secretary Mayorkas both nominated and confirmed, fortunately. And I have to agree with Representative Garcia. I mean, Mayorkas's vision for transforming the department is really, it's both very exciting and necessary, and it's going to take time. On the other hand, the Department of Justice, which is just as important, and especially for those of us in the legal profession, we know that's the other part of the equation that has such an impact on immigrants. They're just getting started in terms of the changes that will be necessary. So I'm very hopeful, but I think that's, again, a place for us to partner together. We, again, in the legal profession, partnering with the Department of Justice and the Biden administration to make sure that those changes are carried out.
I would like to ask one more question from the audience. I've seen a lot of praise for the Citizenship Act, but I've also seen criticism about the inclusion of increased technology at the border. Can someone speak more to this? Border communities have been frustrated with militarization of the border, and we are concerned about increasing the use of technology.
Absolutely. That is, I'll just chime in there. So there are two things I would say about this. One is we are deeply concerned at the National Immigration Law Center about the shift to surveillance and technology as an alternative and a preferable alternative to militarization and the way that the border has been over militarized and frankly, that allows for the criminalization of migrants. Yet, on the other hand, from a civil liberties and human rights perspective, we should equally be concerned about that. So I think that this is a place for a lot of room for advocacy with the Biden administration to make sure that they understand this, especially from that broader perspective of civil liberties and rights. And then what I will say is that for the broader border provisions, the border groups that we work very closely with, I'm thinking of folks who are part of the Southern Border Community Coalition, for example, are all very, so far they seem to be very happy with the approach of the US Citizenship Act and the beginning of really changing that paradigm of seeing the border as a place for and a shift to border governance and accountability and transparency, as well as due process, which needs to come in through the legal system part of that.
Yeah, one important provision, I think, in the US Citizenship Act is the creation of a border advisory council, really acknowledging the need for the border communities to have a voice in what's happening. And I think that would be a particularly important mechanism for helping to sort of create some oversight and monitoring of new uses of technology along the border. So clearly an area where there has to be more development and oversight, I think.
Yeah, and that was definitely one of the, that came about through organizing by border communities as well. So good reminder.
So I have one more question that I want to ask and give you. We only have 5 minutes left. So, and I'd like to give you each an opportunity to make any closing remarks you'd like. So the question is, as chair of the ABA Commission on Immigration and having access to counsel being such a core issue of the ABA, my question is, access to counsel, we all know, or those of us on this panel certainly know, that access to counsel improves the quality of immigration system, results in better outcomes for immigrants, provides efficiency to the courts. The Biden-Harris administration has endorsed some access to counsel, some funding perhaps for counsel. For those in the audience who don't know, there is no right to appointed counsel for the most part for immigrants who cannot afford to hire counsel in immigration proceedings, unlike the criminal justice system. So the Biden administration has called for some limited funding, but my question is, what do you believe is the political support for actually funding legal representation for indigent immigrants and for ensuring access to counsel? How can is there an appetite for not just state and local initiatives, but for some kind of federal funding for indigent immigrants facing removal?
I can start on that. So I would say a couple of things. I think that this is one of the places where the ABA and your voice is so absolutely critical, and your leadership. I think that there is political appetite for sure for children to have guaranteed legal counsel. I think people now understand and have become much more cognizant of the horrors that happen when children are going before an IJ, for example. And we also know the statistics that when people have legal representation, they are more likely to actually comply with the legal proceedings and navigate this real labyrinth that we have of an immigration system. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to make progress. I actually think that we should be making bolder demands of the administration, including through the Department of Justice, in terms of allocation of funding. Look, at the end of the day, we should have something along the lines of a federal public defender program that's specifically for immigrant cases. I think it's going to take a little bit of time, but I do think that this is a place, an opportunity for leadership from the ABA and the commission in particular.
My day job at KIND involves issues of access to counsel for children. That's the providing pro bono assistance and ensuring that children have counsel is core to our mission. But I think, some of the things that we've learned in that process, as Marilena said, is that there is deep support now for access to counsel for children and other vulnerable groups. I think that part of the difficulty we face is an education gap still. on understanding why counsel is important in immigration court. You know, at times we talk about immigration court as a civil, immigration laws are civil enforcement actions, and somehow or other that has translated, I think, in the public's mind into this idea that, well, then the consequences aren't great. But as our immigration laws have become more punitive, as the consequences of removal and deportation have become greater, such that there are many people who, if they are removed, will never reunite with their families, never be able to come back to the United States. If they are asylum seekers, maybe being sent to their death with no prospect of return. As those consequences have gotten greater, the nature of our immigration enforcement is really something that is much more akin to the rights and the needs of people in the criminal system than in a, you know, a civil system of, you know, whether or not you violated noise ordinances or something like that. So I think people don't understand that. I think the ABA has a tremendous opportunity to be part of the voice that educates on that we really do have, as the American Immigration Council said years ago, two systems of justice. This is a moment for us to re-examine the whole justice system in that perspective. And so I agree with Marilena, there's so much more to do to really bring that to the attention, to ask more, demand more of the administration and Congress.
Thank you. It's 12:30, but I do want to give each of you an opportunity if there are any last remarks you'd like to make.
I'll just close by saying, you know, the last 4 years, we were reminded of the important role that law students and lawyers played in defending not just immigrant communities, frankly, defending our democracy. And similarly, I think this is a great time to be alive, to be witnessing, and to be able to help shape the future of our country, and not just on immigrants. I really believe that immigrants are helping to shape our democracy and who we are becoming and who we must become as America. And so the role of lawyers is central. So again, just really grateful, Wendy and Meredith, for the invitation to be part of this panel and to partner with you. I think that the work that we in the legal profession need to do to help, again, not just undo the harms of previous administrations, but to start really building the kind of immigration system that is grounded in racial, economic, and gender justice and equity, relies on us as lawyers and organizers and advocates to help make these changes reality. So thank you again for the opportunity.
And I'll just add that it's been a tremendous pleasure to be on the panel with you, Marilena, and with Congresswoman Garcia and you, Wendy. But it's also been a tremendous honor to be part of the Immigration Commission. This is my third year on the commission, and it has been such an opportunity to really bring together all those strands of why we became lawyers, why we believe that the legal system matters. And I too really think that, you know, whatever issue one's fighting for, you're really fighting for democracy. You're really fighting for the chance to be able to create a world that is one where everybody can prosper and grow. And I think that many people are beginning to realize that the immigration issue combines so many of the deep concerns and divides and you know, values that America faces and wants to improve upon. And so it's really a way, I think, for people to come together and to create a better, stronger country. And so it's been my honor to be involved in it for, like, I don't know, almost 30 years now. And, you know, I wish, sort of like the March of Dimes, that we were in the business of sort of making our work obsolete. Unfortunately, I don't think it will, because immigration is totally about change and new ideas clashing with old and finding that balance. And so the work of the ABA Commission and the ABA folks who are on the call today is so important to that. So thank you.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your wisdom, your perspectives, your expertise, and your commitment to these really important, critical issues and for remaining in the fight for a fairer, more just immigration system. Mary Elena, I completely agree with you that as difficult as the last 4 years were, I was never more proud to be a lawyer. And I said to people at the beginning, I remember now why I went to law school, to fight back against injustices. And I look forward to the commission working with you and other organizations to try to seize this moment and make the system fairer for everybody. So thank you so much. It's been a real honor to moderate this panel. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.